Hi everyone, Phil Parker here from the Lightning Process. Today I want to talk about something called the PER, the Physical Emergency Response, which is central, we think, to the cause of many illnesses and particularly chronic fatigue and ME. So first of all, what is the PER? Well, to go back a few years, a few decades really, to Hans Saleh as a professor who's looking at people who are ill, and he can't understand why these people are not recovering. They've got maybe an operation, they've had a virus, but they keep on staying ill. And he's examining them in hospital, and he finds that they all are developing a sign of a particular syndrome he calls general adaptation syndrome. What he's identified is that physiologically their body is under threat, and he calls this the stress response. But we have to be quite careful of this word, the stress response. When we think of stress, most of us think about emotional stress because that's the linkage we have with stress. But he doesn't talk about stress in that way. He talks about stress like the stress on a bridge, the tension and pressure. Again, tension's a tricky word because it sounds like it's emotional. He's not talking about that. He's talking about the physical demands on physical material and particularly the body. So he calls it the stress response. Now, the stress response is about flight and fight and freeze, which most people have heard about. It triggers all sorts of stuff going on in the body physiologically. We don't use the word stress response mainly because people, as soon as you hear the word stress, they go, oh, that's all about emotional stress. And with the lightning process, there's a lot of misinformation about the lightning process, saying the lightning process is all about stuff in the mind, which it's not. It's all about physiology. So this is one of the reasons we've created this term, the physical emergency response, to really identify that this physical stress response is not an emotional stress response, it's a physical emergency response in the body has to threat. So the PER is the same as the flight and fight, the general adaptation syndrome stress response that Sully talks about. We don't use the word stress just because it confuses people and makes people think, it's all about emotional stuff, which it isn't. And one of the reasons for this is, particularly with ME and chronic fatigue, for years people were told, there's nothing wrong with you, we can't find anything, it's all in your mind. And these people were going, no, it's not, I'm really physically ill, but they could never find anything, they could never understand well enough how people could be this ill, or how the illness could vary, and all those kind of things. When we started to look at it, one of the things that was very interesting about ME and chronic fatigue is they showed lots of signs of this physical change that occurs in long-term stress responses, threat responses, PER responses. So change in immunity, the ability of the immune system to fight off illness, change in the ability to sleep well, uninterrupted or interrupted, unrefreshing sleep, digestive problems, cognitive impairment. All these things happen when you have a long-term flight and fight response going on. And the reason for this is short-term flight and fight response, or PER, is fine. It's a bit like, when you're a kid and you're leaning back on the chair and you're a bit too far. You can feel that trigger in your body. Nothing wrong with that. It's a response to threat, and we get it from physical threat, from trauma, from toxins, and of course from emotional threats as well. But it produces, no matter what the cause of it, it produces the same response, which is a massive triggering of this thing called the sympathetic nervous system, whose job is to manage threats, which basically channels all your blood to your limbs so you can run and fight. It changes the way your blood chemistry is, so it changes the way you process fats and your insulin resistance and sugar and all sorts of stuff. It changes neurotransmitters, produces a number of hormones, particularly adrenaline, cortisol, so a whole range of stuff that goes on, which is all designed to get you out of trouble, but it's also designed for very short on and off. The problem comes, there's nothing wrong with it, the problem comes when there's a long-term triggering of that. When you trigger that system, which has such a big effect on all systems of the body, and you constantly trigger it, so you're constantly under threat, and one of the threats that can happen is, if you have a long-term stress response, that in turn becomes threatening to the body, because it's like being always on alert. That's it's a bit like an army. If you have an army whose job is to fight, after a while, just the stress and pressure of fighting makes them less good at what they're doing, and that in turn causes more trouble on the battlefield. And the body's like this as well. That when you get into a long-term PER or stress response or flight and fight response, there's a real problem for the body, because all the energy is now channeled to the arms and the legs. It's not taking care of the physiology. It's not taking care of the digestion, the immune system, and so on. And there are long-term consequences from that. When people get into that state, their whole body is on high alert, and every tiny signal has a massive response. Imagine if you have a sound system, or you go to a concert and everything's turned up to maximum. It doesn't really matter what you plug into that system, it's going to go blasting out of the speakers. And so this is one of the reasons why people with ME and chronic fatigue have such a range of symptoms, and how strong the symptoms are. The problem is with the way the system, your internal system, your neurological system, your immune system is working, is everything is so responsive and so reactive that a symptom or a bit of information from one part of your body produces this huge response. So you classically find people say, I just can't tolerate noise, chemicals, smells, any exertion. It's like every tiny trigger, every tiny stimulus just creates this massive response in the body, which of course in turn, unfortunately, creates more of this stress PER cycle, which has direct physical consequences to the body. And this is why people with chronic fatigue and ME, A, have lots of symptoms, B, can't do very much, because as soon as they do, it creates this massive response. They do a bit of walking, it's too much for their body. Physically, they can't manage it. They experience a conversation. That conversation can just cause too much cognitive overload, and their brain goes, I can't deal with it. And that is a physical change that occurs with people with ME. And this is why we avoid using the word the stress response, because people misinterpret the stress response as saying, oh, they're just a bit stressed. It's not what it means, it's not what Hans Sally meant by it, it's not what we mean by it, which is why we call it the physical emergency response, because your body has gone onto high alert and is now treating everything like an emergency. It's not doing it on purpose, it's a physical response. And what you've got to find a way to do is to settle that down, to calm that physical response down. There's lots of ways you can do it. The lightning process is one of them. Getting your diet sorted out, pacing is a slow way of doing it. Meditation, mindfulness. What the lightning process looks at is, okay, can we find a way to get you to be in charge consciously, to make a difference to this level of arousal in your nervous system, and to start bit by bit to calm that down, to reset it moment by moment. And that's what the lightning process, one of the cool things it does, is teach you to do. So I hope that explains the PER, the physical emergency response, why we use that term instead of flight and fight or stress response, and some idea of how you might be able to change that, to shift that, so that you can become empowered in changing the way your nervous system is responding to stuff in your body and in the outside world. Hope that's useful for you. Bye.